recently you gave a talk at Boston Public Library about the Pequot War. Can you share for our viewers what was the Pequot War, when did it happen, and who was involved?
Well, the Pequot War was one of the first major conflicts between the English colonists of New England and the indigenous peoples here. It involved all of the existing or emerging colonies of New England at that time, so representatives from Massachusetts Bay, from Plymouth, from the new colony of Connecticut, and from the soon-to-be colony of Rhode Island were all involved on the English side, as well as a number of other indigenous groups that supported the English in this war on the Pequots. And it took place, really the first battles began in the summer of 1636, which involved an attack on Block Island, actually, on the indigenous people of Block Island. And then the war really came to Pequot country in earnest in 1637 and 1638.
And can you talk about the ramifications and the devastation that came out of the Pequot War?
Well, the Pequot War was devastating for the Pequot people. So this was a nation that had numbered as many as 32,000 people. It took Philadelphia until 1800 to reach that population level. So I mean, this is a substantial population, a thriving community that had lived in the region on the Thames River in Connecticut, not too far from modern-day New London and Groton and those areas. This was Pequot territory, was that southern Connecticut, Long Island Sound area. The Pequot had lived there for at least 1,200 years prior to this moment of contact with the English colonists. So the Pequot War resulted in the death of many, many Pequots. There's a famous battle took place which involved an English assault on a Pequot village near modern-day Mystic. And of the 700 people in this fort, almost 500 people were killed at the moment, and survivors were taken captive. Other battles ensued. And what interests me about the Pequot War, and one of the devastations besides this death, destruction of their cornfields, their homes, was the captivity of the Pequots, and the way that captivity kind of became a goal for the English colonists as the war progressed. And they tended to go after the places where women and children had gone to shelter from and be away from the battle. The English colonists went to those places and took these women and children captive with an eye to bringing them back to Boston, Hartford, elsewhere, to be servants in their homes and to export some into a reverse Middle Passage into the Caribbean.
And we don't talk a lot about slavery of the indigenous people. How did it begin through the English, and why is it not talked about as much as we talk about African American slavery?
Well, almost all of the explorers that made contact with the Americas took Native American captives and brought them back to Europe, both to prove they had been to this new place and because they wanted interpreters and guides for return trips and the establishment of colonies. So I mean, this includes Martin Frobisher in the Aleutian Islands. This includes Verrazano in the what is now the New York area, and this included the early explorers of New England. They took captives back from Martha's Vineyard, from Cape Cod, and sold them in slave markets in Spain and elsewhere. But I think the Pequot War is important because it really initiated this enslavement of local indigenous people by the colonists of New England that became a characteristic of their labor system and of their relations with Native Americans, and a major outcome of most of the wars involving English colonists and Native Americans almost up to the American Revolution, through the 1750s. The majority of enslaved people were Native American before 1700. And I'd say that about all of the Americas, but that also includes New England. So people knew about this, at the time, and in the 18th and even the 19th century. There are novels that feature Pequot captives and enslaved Indians that were very popular in the 19th century, stage plays. So I think we've forgotten it in part because the enslavement of Africans is such a big American story. It's so big, I think it sort of overwhelmed the story of indigenous slavery, whose numbers weren't as great. And also some people that we may think of as African or might have been kind of included in African American counts or identification of the enslaved, those people were Native American. or biracial. So there's a sort of mixing of these populations, both within slavery and amongst the free communities of Native Americans, often provided refuge to African Americans. So these racial categories became kind of, became much more fluid, but contemporaries sometimes just called all of these people black over time.
And you talked about the whittling down of that population because of the war. How many members of the Pequot tribe are still here today?
They number in the thousands. But what's interesting is that the treaty that ended the war extinguished the Pequot name. The name of Pequot was not to be mentioned anymore. Many people who weren't taken captive or killed by the English were sort of forced to go live among other indigenous groups in the area. And they were not treated as slaves. I mean, they could resume village life, but they had to be in these new territories. But what happened was that many of those Pequot who moved back to their ancestral territories and were able to reestablish a new tie to the lands that they had once occupied. So they really had a reservation confirmed even in the colonial period by Connecticut. And there's been some continuous habitation in that area right up through the time that the Pequot applied for federal recognition. So, there's this amazing, determination to regroup and return to this place in what is in present-day Connecticut, and to maintain, connections with this past, to know their own past. They're scholars too. They read documents, they pay attention, they maintain these stories and these lineages.
What can we learn from the Pequot War that we can apply to our world today?
Mm-hmm. Well, I write about the Pequot War and view it as what I call an origins moment in the history of American slavery, and in particular the history of slavery in New England, because Massachusetts created one of the first formal legal codes in English America. They were the first out of the gate with a giant compendium of law, and it included a law of slavery. So they're the first to have this legal code, and arguably the first to have a kind of complete description of slavery and who could be enslaved, and a law of slavery, even before places that we can associate more with slavery, like Barbados or Virginia. So Massachusetts is first out of the gate. Why is that? I think it's because of these Pequot captives, because they had taken all of these Pequot captives in the war in 1737, 1738, 16, can we start over again?
Yeah.
So they had taken all of these captives in the war in 1637, 1638, 1641, the statute. So I think the presence of the Pequots was part of the reason for creating this law of slavery. I'd also say that the war is significant because it created these patterns for captive taking and for the enslavement of Native Americans. So in Metacomet's Rebellion, King Philip's War in 1675, 1676, the colonists again took thousands of captives. Almost a third of the surviving Wampanoag, Narragansett, Nipmuc, and other tribal nations at that time were enslaved. Wow. People were exported into the Caribbean, but many were kept in New England to be part of that population of involuntary laborers. And the sort of practice of enslavement and involuntary servitude also continued even after or outside of warfare by the sentencing of people to involuntary servitude by courts and by just outright kidnapping. I mean, I think people are startled and they somehow think there's a law and order that prevents these sorts of things, but there was sort of a human trafficking, particularly in children and women, and the kind of ongoing enslavement of free people, even outside of slavery. So I think in the long term we have to think about how all of these factors fed into emerging ideas about race, about the impact of colonization on Native Americans. It wasn't just dispossession from their lands, but it also included the disruption of family life, the separation of mothers from children and husbands from wives, and all these other sort of damaging effects on their ability to thrive, to live, to have a economic basis for life, and to maintain population. So this is an important part of colonization, is slavery, enslavement, and the taking of Indian labor, as well as other Native American assets. So if we think about the present day, we think about the fact that many of these Native American groups who are affected by these events still exist, and many of them revived and renewed, and gained federal recognition, are now becoming advocates and telling a bigger story about New England's history that includes these Native American groups.
Very multi-layered. And you also wrote a book, Brethren by Nature.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. This is Brethren by Nature. Well, I really started this book as because I ran across a document, and it revealed that Massachusetts had auctioned off captives in this later war, in Metacomet Rebellion, King Philip's War. So the colony official treasurer had held an auction of captives, and babies, families, people of all ages. And I looked at this, and I didn't know about it. And in fact, it wasn't in the textbooks I was using to teach college students American history. So I thought someone should write a book about this, and that someone was me. So I looked both backwards to see the origins of these practices and found them in the Pequot War, and then I looked past to see what happened after these major events of enslavement, and found these examples of kidnapping and the sentencing of people to servitude, using the courts basically to put people into servitude.
And November is Indigenous People Month. Thanksgiving is also right around the corner. What would you like viewers to take away from this war and the Native American slave trade?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to make Native Americans and Indigenous slavery part of this larger history of slavery that we're just learning more and more about. And I think that all of these major research initiatives have really opened up the eyes of many Americans to the enormity of the slave trade, its impact then, and its continuing impact in the present. And I think Indigenous people should be part of that conversation, both as authors of their history and people experts on their history, but also when we're thinking about reparations, or when we're thinking about the long-term effects and traumas of slavery and how they continue into the present. One thing I'd also say, though, is I was on a panel with a number of members of the current Mashantucket Pequot tribal leadership, and they all talked about the fact that for them, some of these, the after effects of slavery are still quite recent, including the forcing of people into involuntary servitude by local officials in a kind of like in the post-Reconstruction South, which happened to African Americans. They were forced to go back and work for their former slaveholders or face arrest for vagrancy by local authorities. I mean, things like that happened in rural areas of Connecticut and Rhode Island and elsewhere. So one of these individuals who spoke last night, his grandfather had been bound into involuntary servitude. And I think if you look at the records in Massachusetts, very similar things were happening in the 19th century, in which both African American children and Native American children were expected to work out in white households. An expectation that often had a little bit of force and pressure behind it. So the idea that we can only, the idea of wanting to control these populations and the relationships can only take place in the context of servitude. So I think that's a legacy that's a little even more proximate even than the Pequot War.
Margaret Ellen Newell, Professor of History at Ohio State University, thank you so much for your time here today.
Thank you so much, Faith, for giving me the opportunity to talk about this important subject.